Good afternoon, and thanks so much for coming back from lunch. We appreciate you coming back from lunch. My name's Henry Shapiro. I'm a principal product manager here for our data platform, so that means things like Insights and NRDB, as well as a bunch of shared capabilities from our teams in Barcelona.
And I'm Susie Dirks, and I manage our mobile monitoring product.
Cool. So we heard a lot this morning about, we've been talking a lot today about three really big trends in your organizations that are impacting the way that your teams work together and impacting the way that you build software. One of those trends, of course, is the move to DevOps, the move to sort of shared ownership of code and shared ownership of infrastructure, or potentially some people are at different points along that transformation. Some people have dedicated ops teams, some people still have dedicated development teams. We talked about the move to microservices and the move to the cloud, which is also introducing its own sort of new complexity. That sort of, yes, you're moving away from the monolith where all of the services and things are all tied up into a single application, but with that sort of comes this new sort of problem, which is how do you make sure that all of these different teams that now own all of these different pieces of the puzzle are working together towards a common goal, and how do you share information across teams? And so really what we're here to talk about today, our presentation's called Next Level Analytics, but really what we're here to talk about today is how New Relic's kind of core capabilities, so the stuff under the hood, the stuff like our different data types and our different shared capabilities that we have across all of our products, how those help you to kind of stitch together this story across all these different teams and across all the different pieces of your stack. And I'm going to talk through the capabilities sort of at a high level, and then Susie's actually going to take us through a workflow that applies all those things. So really not just what are these things and what do they do functionally, but actually like how do I as a developer, how do I as an engineering manager actually apply this to my teams? And so we'll head through that. This is, I don't know how many people here have ever played Zelda, but this reminds me a lot of the Triforce diagram. Really, there's no nerds out here that like Zelda? I just outed myself, I guess. We have what we call sort of our opinionated UI, and you've probably heard about this today. These are things like the products that we build, right? Infrastructure, mobile, browsers, synthetics. So these are things like you add an agent to your software, you add an agent to your infrastructure, we automatically start collecting data, and we spin up this UI really quickly so that you can start getting value, basically instantly out of your applications, right? You can start troubleshooting customer problems, you can start fixing things really quickly. But underneath this, we have two distinct platform sort of sets, and I'll talk about the first as we go through it, which is the data platform. So a lot of people don't necessarily realize that our agents are actually collecting three very distinct and very valuable types of data. So one of those types is what we call real-time application events. So things like, these aren't metrics, these aren't aggregates, these are actual page views, synthetic checks, errors, crashes, right? So every single step, for example, in an e-commerce checkout, we're capturing an event for every HTTP request that was made as part of that, for every page load that went into that. And you can analyze this information, you can add your own details to it to actually see it by customer or see it by account. And so what that gives you is real granularity in terms of how you're troubleshooting problems. I think the Confused video actually kind of teed us up pretty nicely for this in the sense of really getting down to a level of granularity where you can troubleshoot things effectively instead of sort of asking questions that only lead you to more questions. In addition to that, we're capturing operational events. So these are things like configuration changes and deployments. So these are sort of like precursors to the performance issues. So you see a chart in New Relic that has a deployment on it. You see error rates start to spike, and you can actually associate the deployment or the configuration change in the case of infrastructure with changes in performance. And that's another really important class of data that we collect. In addition to that, we're collecting minute-level time slices and samples. So these are things like, think of response time or error rate or CPU usage. And this is really a very traditional thing that you'll see, sort of metrics in the monitoring space. And again, these are really important pieces of data because they give you a sense of how things are trending. They give you a sense of what's happened over time. But once you want to dig deeper and you want to get down to that individual customer level or that individual request level, that's where event data is really valuable. So the combination of events and metrics together is a really important component of what our agents provide and what our products provide. But then, obviously, we also collect detailed traces, and this isn't something we talked about a lot this morning, but traces are actually how you go and fix the problem, right? So once you've found that there's a performance issue, that's great, but you need the sort of stack level, the code level information to help you actually diagnose and fix the issue, to help your developers do that. So that's effectively our data platform. Our agents are collecting all three of these types of data. They're all rolling up into our platform. They're all explorable through insights, and we'll talk about that in a second. But this is really part of how we give you different types of data to troubleshoot very different kinds of problems. We also have what we call our capabilities platform. So we talked a ton about alerts this morning. We talked about baselines, which I think has a nice overlap with the intelligence side of this platform. Really, this is all about giving your teams, in addition to those curated experiences, we want your teams to be able to extend what they have from New Relic. In DevOps culture, it's not just about, I want to use your tool to solve my problem. It's, I want to use your tool in conjunction with other tooling that I have, maybe build tooling or source control or any other thing that my team is using. I want to be able to extend your tool to help my team to integrate it into its workflow and processes. So our APIs for pushing and pulling data from New Relic, obviously maps help you tie everything together. And then Insights as our sort of dashboarding and exploration platform is a great way to get all of that data and customize it, both for teams that are working across different kind of shared ownership capacities. So if you're a team and you have some downstream or upstream dependency and you want to have a dashboard that shows that information in one place, that's what dashboards are there for. But also if you're a line of business owner or you're a VP of engineering and you just want to get sort of a 30,000-foot view of how everything is doing, that's really what that is for as well. So all of this taken together, this is sort of a mouthful, but all of this taken together is really what we've been showing you in this diagram today. And the reason we're sort of harping on it is because this is a really big part of what we're going to talk about today. So these are all the capabilities, but how do you actually fit this into a workflow? And to help contextualize that, I'm going to have Susie come up, and Susie's actually going to take us through sort of a workflow that combines a bunch of these different capabilities into a sort of cohesive story.
All right. Thank you, Henry. So yeah, so Henry brought up a lot of different things. He did bring up different data types, like metrics, events, and traces. He talked about our different product UIs, our opinionated, curated UIs that we have for our different products. And he also talked about using alerts and insights. And so these are things I'm going to actually talk to you about in more detail with a specific example. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about monitoring. And the very basic level of monitoring would be you find out about an issue because a customer tells you they had a problem. And that's not the best version of monitoring. It's the cheapest but the most expensive way of monitoring your issues. But it is still monitoring. So we're going to start with that and say a customer complains. But then we're going to mature a little bit. And on our next round, we're going to improve our monitoring. And we're going to continue to improve. We'll start here with metric style alerts. So for mobile as an example, for best practices, we recommend you have a crash rate alert set up, and you have an error rate alert, and that you set up Synthetics API checks to make sure that the backend APIs that your mobile apps depend on are always actually sending back the response that your mobile app expects. So those are metric alerts. The next time you get around and you want to improve your monitoring more, you might start doing things with event data. And the cool things you could do with that is you can make sure to focus on the services that are absolutely business critical. So when somebody hits that purchase button, those are the things I want alerts on. Or if there's a certain user segment that's especially important to me. Or if there are certain errors I don't care about, and you want to filter those out. So you can start to do things like that using event data. Event data lets you do NERQL and use NERQL alerts, which is now available for everyone, NERQL alerts to actually really customize and pinpoint the things that you care about. So this is a little bit about evolution of monitoring. Once you start monitoring, you might end up logging into New Relic Mobile. And this is an overview page of New Relic Mobile. And here we see, oh gosh, our crash rate did go up. We do have some crash spikes. This is just a way to view, at a high level, there's something interesting going on. Then we can dive in a little bit deeper. So that first view is a metric level view. The metric level view shows us aggregate data. Now we're diving in a little deeper to event level data. So this is something we released last November at FutureStack San Francisco, where we're actually basing our whole crash UI now on event data. What that means is we have the ability to actually slice and dice any of the crashes there by any attribute associated with those crashes, and we have a record of every single occurrence of a crash. So if I just look at a chart and I see crashes over time, that's kind of helpful. I know crash rate might be going up or down, but it doesn't really tell us the whole story on its own. For example, there are bots out there that will ping an app over and over again and will force it to crash. So some of our customers actually have their crash rate is huge, but it's only maybe 2 or 3 devices that are crashing like crazy. You don't know that by looking at this chart, but you do know that once you start to dive in and look at the event data. Another example is that one customer that called in with a support ticket. You don't know which of these crashes is theirs. So to do that, you need event level data. So let's go through that scenario. We're going to do some faceting or grouping by, in this case, authentication email, which is how we track user ID. Everybody can track user ID in different ways. Not everybody can capture email addresses. But sometimes there's some sort of a number, some ID that you could use to find the specific users who complained and pull up the crash associated with them. So what we can do, we group by it. We can also filter to, in this case, W. Brown is the one who complained. Fair enough. The app was crashing like crazy. And so we filter to that particular user, and now we see only the crashes associated with that one person. So we see that the crash chart, there's not quite as many crashes. And we also see in the crash list is only one type of crash. This is not information you can get from looking at metric data. So this is letting us dive in really deep. So we want to isolate, we want to focus our efforts on the crash that we're trying to fix right now. We can make that decision, we can prioritize in different ways. Right now, we want to fix the one that somebody actually submitted a support ticket for. So we do want to focus in on this user's crashes. And we could actually even focus in even more. So from the curated UI experience, you can actually step over into Insights and rerun the same query we used for that chart. And then you can start modifying it. So for example, if I want to facet by app version, I can see whether or not that user had the same exact crash happen to them across different versions of their app. And I can also make sure that the app version they're on right now is actually our latest release. I could broaden the scope as well. This is just a way of exploring the information and figuring out where I want to focus. Then I can go back into the details of the crash. So I'm ready to actually troubleshoot that particular user's crash. To do this, we have some details on the crash. And we have something brand new released today. It was announced this morning. It's the new crash event trail. The crash event trail, as implied, includes event data. And that event data, actually in this case, shows the time-stamped occurrence at every event during that session that crashed. So this is super helpful for mobile developers to debug a problem. You could say the same thing about other APM for other backend applications, browser applications as well, because you're able to see the series of events that led up to a particular issue. These events in this case include things like HTTP errors. They include any custom events that our customers are tracking. And they can include now brand new breadcrumbs, which is anything that you want to track in the app code to help you debug a crash in the future. So this is one way that developers can troubleshoot their crashes. That's event data. The other way is trace data. And as Henry pointed out, this is absolutely crucial. This is how we know what file to look at, what line number in that file to look at to solve the crash. We're going to go through, we're going to troubleshoot it. We're actually going to figure out a fix, or what we think is a fix for the problem. And then there's a really cool way to validate that. So let's go through that. We had one customer who complained about this particular crash. So what we can do is we can set up a NERQL alert for that one user, send them out our new build where we think we have a nice fix for them, and see if the crash happens to them again. Look, we're monitoring very specific, and we can see whether or not they're running into the same issues anymore. We can obviously broaden that to a wider scope of users to see if anybody else is experiencing a crash of the same type. So in this particular scenario, doesn't always happen this way. Sometimes it's the app code itself. But in this scenario, the crash was actually caused because Backend API sent bad data to the mobile app. Now, the mobile app developer can figure out a way to protect the app from crashing. But in the end, it's still going to end up being a bad end user experience because there's bad data. There's going to be at least errors. And maybe the app isn't going to be functioning very well. So it's still good information for the mobile app developer to know that there are problems, and they don't necessarily have control over the backend APIs and the services that those depend on and the infrastructure that those depend on, right? But it's really helpful for them to know if something's coming down the pipe that's going to affect their apps. So something that they can do is they can set up synthetics API checks to make sure that the backend APIs are always doing what their mobile apps want them to do. They're sending, based on a certain request, they're sending the response back that the mobile apps are prepared to receive. So that's not only helpful for the mobile apps team just to know that a problem's coming, but it's also super helpful for collaborating across teams. I've talked to hundreds of customers over the last 2 years, and this comes up all the time. It's really hard for a mobile app team to feel ownership for mobile performance when a lot of that performance impact is coming from deeper in the stack. It's coming from the APIs, the services those services depend on, and the infrastructure. So what this does is it gives the mobile app team a way to say, hey, you guys, I'm having an issue, can you help me? And it's a way to communicate that. And then we can take that further. So I'll go ahead and set up this synthetics check. So I can say how often I want it checked. I can set up the script for it. And then I can start piecing together a dashboard. Now, this dashboard can serve a couple different purposes. It can help me mature in my monitoring because I'll have the catch-all crash rate alert, but I can also start to say, all right, well, this customer in particular, I want to make sure never crashes again. And these errors, I want to make sure aren't considered issues because I think that status code 401 is fine. So you can really start to tune it. But the other thing you can do with your dashboard is you can start to communicate across teams. So for example, say the highest priority item on a mobile app is the purchase button. Or say that it's registering a new user for your services. That you want to make sure works all the way through the stack. And so you should have a dashboard for that. And that dashboard should include the mobile app perspective in terms of crashes and HTTP errors, the APM perspective in terms of transaction errors, and the infrastructure perspective for all the things that are being supported, that it's supporting to make all this work. So what that does is it has one single place for a team to work together to monitor and to debug issues. The really cool thing is if you build this dashboard based on one issue that already happened that you don't want to happen ever again, and you work together to find a fix, it's great to use the dashboard to validate that fix because there's nothing so gratifying to a collection of teams as to watch errors drop down to the right. It's a great feeling. Everybody worked together to make it happen, and they can feel good about their success. So that's it for the example that I wanted to share. Back to you.
Cool. So Susie took us through a really common example, I think, of how people are using all of our tools in conjunction and are basically using the entire platform as part of their workflow. We're going to have Declan from Ryanair coming up in a minute here, and Ryanair has just done some really unbelievable stuff across our platform. I won't steal his thunder because he's also taller than I am, so I'm afraid he might beat me up. And then on the New Relic side, actually, internally, we use New Relic quite a bit to monitor across the entire platform. So We actually had an issue not long ago where we were experiencing higher than average latency on a particular set of queries. And basically, in a multi-tenant environment, you often run into these scenarios where a particular account or a set of accounts can actually send you a lot of requests, or disproportionately more requests than others. And so we were actually able to use the team that was sitting in the emergency room, which is one of the areas where a lot of other DevOps teams will sit when they're trying to triage something. They were sitting in the emergency room and using APM and alerts to actually figure out, hey, latency is spiking. But then they were using insights to actually hone in on particular customers. And to Susie's point, they were actually getting down to that kind of account level so they could actually, diagnose the issue based on that particular user or that particular set of users. And then in the future, obviously, when that issue occurs, they're able to set up alerts based on that account. And they're also able to in the future, kind of know that that account might be something to look for. So to kind of bring it home, I want to sort of really reinforce that, to us, the New Relic platform is really part of fitting into your workflow, and that workflow takes into account different problems, right? So different problems that different teams may be taking ownership of. Each one of those teams has a different set of users and different things that they're concerned with, and we really want to make sure that our customers have a cohesive suite of tools to solve each distinct problem. And that's really what the digital intelligence platform is all about, is really pulling together all these teams and being able to kind of fit into this new workflow that your teams need. So with that, I want to thank you very much, and here's Glenn. Thanks a lot.